morning, everybody. Welcome to Solidarity Live. Unfortunately, I don't think any of our topics are cheerful this week, but there's a lot going on in the world. Hi, Alex. How are you?
Hi, Jocelyn. Yeah, it's a somber show today, but I mean, we do have Care Bears we can talk about. We can start off with the positive of people power and what we can achieve when we stand together, and then we will look really into some bleakness. I think in COVID around the world, just killing and accelerating death toll, as the U.S. is sort of facing a different point where our vaccination rates are lessening the death toll here. And in America, people are like, oh, it feels like we're returning to normal. And elsewhere in the world where there are no vaccines, it is looking like the bleakest times that we faced in this country. And the key thing there is the vaccines and the access to the vaccine. So we're joined by Merith Basey, who is going to talk with us about how we're going to vaccinate the world, and also Care Bears. As an aside, they play an important role. But also how far we have to go on that. And then later in the show, Jocelyn, you and I are going to talk about human rights violations and war crimes in Israel and Gaza. And it will be a not fun discussion, but a critical one to have. And there are always bright spots, even in the darkest times. I think there are people recognizing that ally or not, no one can get away with war crimes. And so anyways, it's gonna be a show, that's for sure, a very specific show on some very difficult topics. Merith, let's start with Care Bears, though, because I said we could start with some smiles. It's always a good way to go. Why do I keep bringing them up?
Sure. Good question, Alex. And good morning to you both. Thanks for having me back. So we helped persuade the current Biden administration to support the TRIPS waiver last week through the cunning use of Care Bears. They were part of a number of creative actions, right? But sharing is caring, and that's what we were trying to remind the Biden administration to do. And the TRIPS waiver, on that same day, last Wednesday, we were having a rally on the National Mall, and we kind of got to announce live that this had actually happened. And it was sort of a historic move it was the same day as the World Trade Organization is having these negotiations. And while the support of the TRIPS waiver won't yet end the pandemic, and it is a waiving of the rights or monopolies, I should say, on COVID-19 vaccines. So I sort of see this as like a chess move, right? It was a check on capitalism. It was a check on the biomedical R&D system, and most importantly, Big Pharma as well, to say that actually this time the US government was not going to directly align with those massive corporations and would favor people over profit.
So let me just do sort of a follow-up on that, Jocelyn, if you don't mind, which is everything Merith just said is factually accurate and exactly what happens. And the Care Bears were the ones that won the day. It was actually a global effort of something that I think Merith and I might have a very good understanding of. We've done this many times before, actually. Like, this is not the first time that stuff like this has come up. In the HIV epidemic, which is a current pandemic that's ongoing, there were a lot of questions about this as well. Like, we can actually end the HIV epidemic right now with the drugs that are available. But pharma, these companies have a monopoly on them, and they're like, nah, we like making money more than saving lives. And now we're going to go with people dying. And actually, the US has really never been on the right side. Sometimes we've like forced them on the right side, but then pretty quickly they've gotten offsides again. And this is different. So when the U.S. is saying we're going to take this role that intellectual property is not sacrosanct, that in fact people's lives are more important than intellectual property, not even getting into the fact that it was also all developed with public dollars, which it was, But even if it wasn't, the idea that intellectual property is more important than people's lives is also wrong. So it's our intellectual property as the taxpayers, and it still is not as important as people's lives. On the other side, we still have Germany, the EU. There are big players on the other side of us. But in my recollection, this is the only time that the U.S. has played this role. This is the first time where the U.S. is right before other people. U.S. usually is the absolute last one and is like, all right, fine. And then they're like, we're the good guys.
Yeah. It was historic. And as I said, sort of what we've seen now, very quickly afterwards, New Zealand changed its position on the TRIPS waiver. And then we saw earlier this week, Canada did. So you sort of see this global politics, this game sort of play out. Sadly, it's a game that they're playing with people's lives, and you would think that ultimately it would be a very obvious choice. But surprisingly, Germany, Switzerland are now still holding out, but the UK are beginning to open up to these negotiations. But, they may not finish by until the end of the year, and that is really not soon enough, right? So we need to keep the pressure on. We need to keep the pressure on the Biden administration in particular to also follow through at this point as much as possible on those commitments. And of course, scale up manufacturing here in the United States as well, because of the extraordinarily terrifying, horrifying situation that you're seeing in India right now, with over 262,000 people who have already passed from COVID. Like, we're seeing what we sort of saw at the height in earlier this year and the end of last year with COVID in the US. But we think those numbers are much, much higher because many of those deaths are going unrecorded. And it's not only India that this is playing out. There's many other parts of the world, including Brazil too.
Sorry, you guys, can we scroll it back for a minute? Could ideally Merith explain what the TRIPS waiver is for people who don't know?
Sure. So TRIPS, in a nutshell, it stands for like trades-related intellectual property rights, related aspects and it's related to the World Trade Organization. And there is a TRIPS, something called the TRIPS flexibilities, which normally is in place to allow things to happen in an unusual way around intellectual property rights and corporations and the role they play to prevent access to medicine. So the flexibilities existed to basically allow countries to not let their populations die. They could say, hey, well, at WTO, can we go a different way, because we'd rather not have you enforce these intellectual property monopolies. But this waiver was led by India and South Africa starting back in October. They've been pushing for this agreement, saying like, we need you to loosen or relax or get rid of essentially these monopolies on COVID-19 vaccines during a global pandemic. My goodness, like, you would think that this would be an obvious choice and that there would be something in the existing mechanisms to allow for this to happen automatically. But, our friends in the global south, like I said, India and South Africa have been pushing this and leading the drive for this waiver since that time. And yet here we are many months later.
It is just so incredibly mind-baffling that there are people in the world who would even want to monopolize for profit a life-saving medicine. Like, that is perhaps a hole in my understanding of the world, because it seems as though if you're already making just crazy amounts of money off of this drug, the least or it's not a drug, a vaccine, the least you could do would be ensure that it's available to everybody. I mean, these people now have so much blood on their hands. Even if we resolve this issue entirely today and everybody got vaccinated today, so many people have died already. I mean, it's mind-boggling.
Yeah, mind-boggling. Capitalism is at the heart of this. Unfortunately, once again, it is not going to be the solution to this problem. And I think, like, when we see what happened last week, like, ultimately, I think COVID has, shone light for many people on this primary problem, that the way we're making medicines, the way we're researching and developing medicines, and then the way we're distributing them is not equitable, and it doesn't make sense. Like, right now, all of the investment is socialized, like the research and development, all of the risk we take on as the public, and then all of the profit is privatized, and we give up the control so that a few corporations can determine the lives, or in this case, they are sending many people to their deaths by not opening up the intellectual property on these medicines. So it's been at the heart of this movement for many, many years, since at least the HIV/AIDS, the height of that crisis.
So I like that because Merith and I come from this world, we just started in like the middle end, and Jocelyn was like, you should start at the beginning. But it's more fun to go backwards anyways. Start in the middle, folks.
On the off chance that people watching are not deeply enmeshed in the pharma patent law fight. Sorry, Alex.
But that's why I, with that cue, going actually really far back in the beginning, because this is a consciousness shift. And all I mean then is that you've been lied to your whole life about how things work with medicines, pharmaceuticals, vaccines, and everything. You've been lied to since, if you're in America, you're lied to literally every time you turn on the television. It's just like boom in your face. So I understand that people are like, no, it can't be that simple. And so it's a big consciousness shift. And that sounds like a hippie thing. But I mean, like, you got to understand you've been lied to. It's propaganda. And get to where the truth is, and not be like, well, it's probably somewhere it's not in the middle. The propaganda's goal is to move you so that what you think of as the middle is actually still a lie. So I want to actually get people to understand this about the vaccines right now, what we could do immediately is bring on excess capacity that exists right now to produce hundreds of millions more vaccines around the world. And right now, we could build the capacity to produce billions of vaccines and vaccinate the world. But there's A, excess capacity right now, and B, we know how to bring things online. And if you look at what we've done in the US, it took 3 months to actually bring online the capacity that we needed when we upped capacity. 3 months, okay? So we have excess capacity now, and we could produce in 3 months billions more doses. And literally, the only thing that is preventing that reality are these corporations being like, whoa. But then we wouldn't make enough money. And all the governments are like, hey, they have a point. They say they won't make enough money. And the governments are like, oh, yeah, definitely. They should make money. I mean,
they've already made billions. They've already made billions off our publicly funded research and development, right? So
we paid for it. And then they're like, oh, cool, you invented this. I'll sell it to you. It's going to be $18 billion. And we're like, sweet, here you go. We will buy our stuff from you. And what we're talking about, bring it to really hit on how dumb. It's not just it's dumb, because right now this pandemic is raging out of control. A global conflagration is what we're seeing. And India produces not just the stuff for COVID, but for all of our medical stuff. This is a vicious cycle that we're entering if we allow countries to just go down because, Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson don't think they're making enough money. Moderna didn't even exist 4 years ago. So like, what did they even have any standing? Sorry.
It's
Merith?
extraordinary. I was just going to say that like COVAX, which was sort of set up to be this global plan to help vaccinate the world, 93% of the countries who are asking for vaccines are asking for more doses. They can't meet the demand, right? We're way, way, way behind. And so, there is this opportunity to share the technology and know-how. There are other voices like Bill Gates who have been saying that initially, prior to last week, were saying, no, this waiver won't do anything at all. And then when the US moved, when the Biden administration supported the waiver, even Bill Gates had to come out and say that they supported a narrow waiver. Like, we don't want a narrow waiver, but you see the sort of the power at work here.
And just for everyone you started in the middle there on Bill Gates. Is he generally absolute garbage on this, or is he generally pretty good? I'll say he's generally absolute garbage on this, and he is like the king of the neoliberal castle. So he really protects this idea that intellectual property, that patents are so critical that actually sometimes, even though it hurts your heart, you have to let thousands, millions of people die because otherwise the patent might be affected. So
yeah, he's never been an ally in sort of the movement for access to medicines, despite being in the public health space. But he made all his money in intellectual property. So, his ideology is quite different. But all of that to say that, even Bill Gates has been his hand has been forced to some degree, but we need to push further. And also just from the capitalist perspective, if we want countries to reopen, if we want travel and trade to continue, the fastest way to do that is, even if you don't care about people, it's still vaccinating people and saving lives at the end of the day. If you want to save the economy, if that's your priority, before saving lives. But either way, it's the same solution.
Well, and that's, when you're organizing around this, Merith, do you face any resistance to that idea? Because it seems like it's only coming from very rich people with a lot of power.
Well, I think, again, sort of when we think about what's happening in the last year, I think people, I do believe that people are waking up to see this injustice that we have been ranting about for a long time in terms of access to medicines. But it's like now that everybody is impacted, and you look at the data and the polling data on different populations in Europe, in the US, even in the US, right, that people are supporting these initiatives, right? There is people power behind these ideas. And a lot of that is obviously, of course, that people have been stuck at home and are trying to understand how to get out of this. But also it's very obvious, and I think, I do think we are at a critical moment. And I think there is an opportunity here, not just to push for access to COVID-19 medicines, but for all essential medicines. And that's the bigger picture, because we don't want this to just be something that we come up for air, COVID, and boom, we get hit by another pandemic. And there will be more. So we have to radically change the way we think about the way we research and develop medicines, the way we distribute them, because otherwise this will be a constant, I think, and it could be even worse if we have something that is, includes an antibiotic resistant, who knows what, bacteria in the future. So I think this is just, a microcosm in a way of everything that we need to move towards in terms of making a more equitable system, not just here in the United States, but around the world.
something that you say equitable system, and I think most of our listeners are with us on this. They get that, but you also said earlier, basically, like, do it for the wrong reasons. You care about just protecting the economy, do it for that reason. It's the same thing here. Like, you don't even have to care about people, right? Like, you can be like a Bond villain type person, but if you don't want the species to be eradicated, then you have to recognize that we need to do pandemic prevention differently. I actually studied pandemic preparedness years ago, and like we this is all written out. Like, we've known this for a really long time, but we just haven't done anything about it. And then we run around trying to play catch up. And the fact that we were able to get the vaccine out so fast is because we were doing some work. The scientists were doing work, and there was money put into this because of SARS and other potential pathogens. But we only have a few minutes. We should have a whole another show on emerging infectious diseases. But like, if this was SARS, right? It's a species ender. That's what we worry about. We worry about a pandemic influenza, like an H5N1 pandemic influenza that actually just kills everybody. And the systems that we put in place have to take the magnitude of harm into account. And even if they had to be really painful solutions, you're like, okay, well, balance the existence of humanity versus, no one can have a dog anymore. And you're like, man, but dogs are awesome. This isn't even close to that. It's balance the existence of humanity versus like 16 ludicrously rich people won't get ludicrously richer. And everybody will win. So it's like, we can protect humanity. Everybody wins. Our drug prices come down. It's literally across the board. Everyone's like, this is amazing, except for like 16 old, probably all white dudes in a boardroom being like, shucks.
Yeah, and
our money.
The lobbyists on Capitol Hill that they pay for, right, as well.
But whatever, those lobbyists will find new jobs.
But I think, to your point with, it's the antibiotic resistance is something that, the access to medicines movement, the public health broader community, the WHO, the World Health Organization, has been concerned about for a long time. But then we must learn the lessons of COVID, like sharing and collaboration, not just at a community level about how we're trying to get out of some of the horrifying things that we've seen. Mutual aid has been a big thing here in the US, people supporting people, but we also need to do that in the scientific community, sharing data, openness, like across the world. And it seems to also be the same lessons that we're going to need to learn if we're going to combat things like climate change. Like, we're on one planet, this is a preparation. And if we don't learn these lessons, we're going to be condemned to the same future. But I do think there is hope in the fact that things are shifting, but we really need everybody to support these initiatives and keep the pressure on. As the US opens up, it doesn't mean that life is going back to normal, and we need to pay attention.
Merith, I love that you bring that up. I think it's, it feels like sometimes these can be all different issues in these little silos, but it's kind of the same techniques, right? We're kind of saying the same. I mean, do you feel that way? It's the same fight played out on with different details.
Yeah, and I think the more that different movements see that connectivity, like, it will be revolutionary in that sense. It's like, wait a second, we're all fighting these big issues, but it's the same enemy, right? At the heart of it. And I do think capitalism is very much part of that. And the frameworks that we've set up, that we are now destined to repeat unless we decide to change them. But we can change them. They're man-made. They're not laws of nature. This is the beauty of all of it, is we can change them.
And It's solidarity, pragmatic solidarity that you're talking about. So it's like the solution is also the same. Pragmatic solidarity. When we are working towards a just future, we have to materially benefit people's lives right here and now as we build towards that future. And that's going to get us there. If we're just narrowly focused in our silos and they slice us this way, we lose. We have to bring these swipes in and be like, look at how much of this is us. There's really only a very few people at the top. They like us in silos. And we want to be in I don't know what this is, a cake or something. And the only people who are not there, it's 1,600 people who control 94% of the wealth in this world, right? Mm-hmm. Like there's way more of us than them. And they're the only ones who lose in this. But at the end of the day, even they win because they can't exist on a dead planet either. So in solidarity,
you can't eat money in the end.
No. They'll try, they'll choke on it. Merith, where can people get involved with Universities Allied for Essential Medicines and the work that you do in the People's Vaccine and or bringing Care Bears to bear on global problems?
Solidarity Live, sharing is caring, right? You hear it. But freethevaccine.org, peoplesvaccine.org. I think you can find us as well on social media. But that's a great start. But just to say that this is not just about one or two groups. This is many, many people, many organizations in many different countries all around the world pushing for a more equitable vision of not just vaccine distribution and access, but something bigger, which is about a global R&D system that works for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Merith, thank you so much for joining us here on Solidarity Live, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks for having me. Be well. See you soon.
Bye, Merith.
Bye.
So, Jocelyn, I wanted to have a clip to start the next segment, but I don't know if you have any thoughts to close this segment on global vaccine justice.
Well, Merith is wonderful, and she always makes me feel more hopeful, so that's nice, because
True.
What we're about to discuss is not so hopeful.
Yeah.
Oh, I forgot to say something about India. So for people, I don't know if a lot of people realize this unless they closely follow global pandemic trends. India was doing crazy well for the first wave. And I think that people watching this tragedy play out really need to wrap their minds around for up and through like January. India had almost no COVID death, proportionally speaking, and then the second wave hit them hard because they're
a variant,
right?
And it's like that's what I'm saying. Do it for the wrong reason. Like if the variants don't scare you, then you don't know how it works. But like it's a different bug, and it's wrecking India right now. We couldn't even handle the first one. We got wrecked in America by the first one, and 5,000 deaths a day in this country. We know the reporting's not totally correct, but India, Brazil's 4,000 deaths a day. Like we don't have much to crow about in this country about our COVID response, except one thing that we've done well, which is we've vaccinated a lot of people. Our mass vaccination program works. That's why it's so important, what we just talked about. It's literally the only thing that we've done well. These other countries, many of them have done really well before. They did well with the public health stuff.
Which, if you've never been to India, a lockdown in India is way more of an achievement because their cities are way more urban than ours are. They're very like close living quarters. Everything is, it's just a much more populous country. So, and a much more community oriented culture.
With huge levels of poverty, just inequality at a huge level. Inequality also drives pandemics. So rich and the poor, that's a recipe for pandemics. It's well documented. India in pandemic preparedness is actually the nightmare scenario always starts with India as the epidemiological pump. So there's so much virus and infection floating around in India with very little infrastructure to actually tamp it down, that's where you face a mutation, that you get a new variant, which can rip through everything. And, again, it's only in pandemics where and climate change, and nuclear war, but these are species enders, right? Like these actually can eliminate humanity as a going concern, and possibly consciousness from the universe, although it's probably unlikely. But we only know of ourselves, and so possible. That's the seriousness with which we need to vaccinate the world. The second variant that's ripping through these countries right now is not the last one. And we need to actually get it under control before we get a third and more deadly one.
Well, and that's, for like, if people don't realize this, the faster everyone gets vaccinated, the less space the virus has to mutate. And that is the problem, that we have countries who did everything correctly, locked down correctly, and now they're getting demolished. And they need our support. They need vaccinated. They need oxygen, ventilators, all that stuff. And it's tragic. It's tragic. Yeah. But anyway,
although I will also say Brazil did not do everything correctly. Brazil, where my family is from, Bolsonaro is terrible, and they have been getting crushed pretty much the whole time. But now the variant out of Brazil is just, it's a nightmare scenario, and it won't stop. Viruses don't care about borders, so this just keeps going, and we need to vaccinate the world to protect ourselves. Like, do it for the humanity if you're a good person. If you're a bad person, just do it selfishly, because otherwise you're going to die. That's why you need to vaccinate the world. Speaking of selfish, I feel like we should talk about, or we can, let's watch this clip that I got queued up to talk about Israel and Gaza and what's going on there now, and America and the role that the U.S. plays. So, Brad,
this is our business because we are playing a role in it. And the United States must acknowledge its role in the injustice and human rights violations of Palestinians. This is not about both sides. This is about an imbalance of power.
So yes, it is about an imbalance of power. Israel is a country, and the Palestinians who are living in Israel live under the power of Israel. They're in occupied spots in Gaza and in the West Bank. And what we're talking about is what kicked it off is actually it's Trump and the U.S. Acknowledging that the capital of Israel is Jerusalem instead of Tel Aviv, and with that, we embolden Netanyahu and the right wing to just really go after that. And what that meant is stealing people's houses in East Jerusalem, and this was court okayed. So the Israeli ethno-nationalist state okayed this legally, right? But slavery was legal as well. But that's what is happening, is that the legal machinations have allowed the confiscation and the robbing of Palestinian and Arab people who live in East Jerusalem, with the idea that there will be no more East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem, just one Jewish Jerusalem as the capital of the Jewish state of Israel. That's what they say. That's the point. And that obviously runs into the problem that people don't like having their stuff stolen from them. And so there was violence but it has kicked off into a level that we haven't seen in a while. It hasn't been that long, because this is Israel Palestine we're talking about. But basically, and people have different opinions on this. Basically, what it is Netanyahu failed to form a government. The prime minister of Israel, the right-wing fascist. And when he is out of government, he's going right to prison because he's a crook as well. So like, we paint this big, but also remember it's also very small. It's about one man not wanting to go to prison. He can't form a government, but no one else can form a government either. So when that happens, and it looks like maybe Netanyahu is losing power, he just shakes it up. He starts something using his ultra-nationalist allies to attack Palestinians, and then they kick off a war. And then in Gaza, you have Hamas who fire some rockets into Tel Aviv, and then Israel responds with the full force of a first world advanced economy, military, backed by billions of dollars of U.S. money and U.S. Bombs and planes and missiles and radars and drones and tech, literally against an open-air prison of 2 million people in Gaza, and just hammering it with airstrikes. And the people of Gaza can't leave. They're not allowed to go anywhere. They're locked in to this place with 60% unemployment. Right, everything that they do is under the control of the Israeli state, and then Israel is firing the full force of their military at this open air prison that they operate for people who they have decided are not as equal as other people in the Israeli state.
I think it's really important to be vigilant of these dynamics when we listen to the way this is covered, because one thing that I find just so interesting is the way that if you're experiencing this story from a lot of mainstream news sources, it's going to sound like this. Well, some Palestinian teens beat up a Jewish person, and then some Jewish people beat up a Palestinian person. And it's like, oh, like they both just hate each other so much. And look, I am not trying to in any way, shape, or form minimize the tragedy of any Israeli civilians who are killed, or minimize what it would be to be brutalized for your religion. Like, of course not. That's, as an individual tragedy, that is tragic. But if you're going to cover a story that is political in nature, you need to be intellectually honest about the political powers at play. And it is not the case that it's like, oh, those two crazy kids, would they just stop fighting? It's not an equal fight. It's not. It never has been, and it's definitely not now. The first few rockets that Hamas fired into Jerusalem, they didn't even hit anybody. And I think that's since changed. Like, I don't know the number, but a few people have been killed now. But the numbers are not equal, and the firepower is not equal.
Yeah, there is no sort of metaphor that you can use that covers it, because you have it's very important that Israel is a self-identified ethno-state. It is a Jewish state, and therefore all Jewish people have a right of return to go to Israel. And in fact, now legally, what the court decision, I believe, if I have a good understanding of it, including East Jerusalem. So people can actually, who never have lived in this geography, can move there based on their identity and actually displace people who have lived in this geography for generations. And then these Palestinians are forced into these reservations. And then they are systematically deprived of rights and ability to have a fruitful life. Systematically, like the terror of the state coming down on them at all turns. I think the only thing that would be like somewhat similar is actually if the U.S. were launching military actions against an American Indian reservation in America, right? Like if We were saying, we took your land, we put you on these reservations, and the difference is, it's not ongoing right now, but that would be the imbalance of power, right? And you would never look at that and be like, what? How are you? They don't have anything to match the U.S. military. That's like not at all a fair fight or anything like that. The actions that Israel is taking are recognized war crimes, collective punishment, all the recognized war crimes. The UN comes out with it like clockwork, just all the time. Everything that's going on in Gaza is illegal by the laws of the world that the US is part of. But Israel would not be able to do what they're doing if it was not for US backing, 100%. And the only non-local power that can change anything there is the US. It's our dollars, it's our military hardware. And we've seen it before. I don't have the whole story in mind, but it was Bush 1, Poppy Bush, who actually, he just threatened to withhold aid. And that was enough to change the whole game. Israel came to the table immediately. They stopped doing what they were doing. And Bush 1 was able to actually come down a little bit hard on them. And so that if Biden actually did that, if he even vocalized threatening the aid and vocalized a change in stance even slightly on U.S. carte blanche support for the right-wing fascist government of Netanyahu, it would change the dynamic immediately. But that has not happened. We continue to see from the State Department, like they ask, like, oh, well, is killing children. Gaza is like 50% children as well, minors under the age of 18. Is killing children, a war crime? And the State Department had to be like, well, I don't know the specifics here. And they had to equivocate. And you're like, okay, if you can't answer that question at your job, you probably should get a new job, because that's a pretty clear one that killing children is abhorrent. And our policies that enable that are likewise abhorrent. But here's the hope, Jocelyn. I know it's bleak.
Oh, are we? Is there hope in this one?
There is hope. All right, just a little bit more bleak. And there's a lot of, like, you have to be careful when you're talking about all issues. But the careful that you should really have is just being honest about what's going on. Right. And if you make a mistake from a place of good faith, like, take the criticism and be like, oh, I didn't know that, I was wrong. But we have to be truth tellers about what's actually happening and what we're seeing. And I want to say this is worse than what Israel has done before. Because before, when Netanyahu needed to shake up the domestic political situation, he went to the settlements within the West Bank. And I don't want to detail like every little bit, but legally it was like slightly different what they would do. They would take like the choicest land and the choicest water rights, and they would deprive what was established Palestinian land of the ability to actually work, right? So they would take the water rights that were going to an olive field before, and then that olive field would perish, and then the Palestinians would move out, and then the settlers, Israeli settlers, would move in, and the state built roads that only Israelis can drive on and Palestinians cannot. The power of the state was aimed at allowing the settlers to do that. But this is different and worse. And if you listen to like news, citizens, Israelis actually talking about it and sort of like their okayness with literally in East Jerusalem just stealing people's houses, directly stealing people's houses based on this court decision and being like, well, it's legal. That is worse than what it was before. So they're even more outrageously illegal. The actions that they're taking are even more illegal than before. Recognized crimes that are illegal against international law. So the U.S. it's not the status quo that we're defending now. It's actually worse than the status quo. And so if Biden decides that he's going to defend this, it means we've actually like allowed Israel to be worse, to be more aggressive as a state against people that it controls within its borders, the Palestinians, and then protected them, stood by while they committed egregious war crimes of launching indiscriminate missiles into areas with civilian casualties, the whole thing, right? That's the bleak. So you thought maybe there was hope too fast, Jocelyn. So I wanted to pour on the bleak. But here's the hope. It's a question to you.
Yes.
That speech from AOC, that was one of there's like a dozen members of the House who went to the floor yesterday and said unequivocally Israel is committing war crimes and the U.S. is aiding and abetting those war crimes, and that makes the U.S. culpable for those crimes. And that collective lie that we've been telling for a long time is starting to break down. And there's a march in Chicago for Palestinian liberation and justice that was enormous. And it does feel like, and it's more than feel, I can state with authority, argument from authority, which is a fallacy, but whatever, from my personal watching of this, it's wildly different now than it was even just 4 years ago or so. The people are much clearer in this country that they've been lied to. We've been lied to about what's going on there. And that is massive. That's that consciousness shift that I was talking about in the last segment. It seems like it's actually accelerating and has started to really take hold here. Am I way off on that?
Well, no, and I wanted to say something about that. I think what's really interesting about the Israel-Palestine situation is the massive gaslighting that has existed for as long as I've been alive, where we have been taught to think of saying anything about the rights and safety of Palestinians as being some radical thing to say. It's not radical. There is nothing radical or strange about saying we should not be bombing children. We should not be funding people who bomb children. And the overly cozy relationship between Israel and America, it's done. I mean, the time has come to re-examine that, because this is no longer a situation where we can turn our blind eye. And I think you're right. I mean, it is really nice to see the amount of free Palestine rhetoric coming. It's way more virulent. It's everywhere. And I think that's exciting. That's exciting because for so long, it's been framed as like you're some kind of radical commie if you think that Israel shouldn't be able to do whatever it wants with Gaza. That's disturbing. That's disturbing.
And we're literally the last country. So I will, so hope, back to bleakness. We blocked it again. The U.S. Security Council actually was like, hey, Israel, here is the world condemning your war crimes in the U.S. again under the Biden administration. So this is as foreign policy has said no and blocked that global condemnation. I could be off. I'm sure like people who watch this way closer are like, oh, you forgot. I don't want to name a country because I'm probably wrong. But maybe there's one country that stands with us, but generally it's just the United States. Every other country is like, we can't allow these war crimes to continue. And the US blocks any global action on that. So we have to change the levers of power still. And that means pressuring the Biden White House enormously. And I think we will. There's more potential for that now. And I actually missed a few things, and I'm sorry, I'm not an issue expert on this. It's also very sad and very terrible to witness again for I can't remember the second Intifada was like 20. I think this is the fourth time in my life. 41, where full-scale war has kicked off, and Israel is going to launch a ground assault into Gaza, literally an open-air prison. They're going to send a military ground assault in there. But I will say what kicked it off is actually worse than what I said. So the confiscation of Palestinian homes is really, that like starts it simmering. Also, I will say they did this during Ramadan, a holy month for Muslims. So this is a month of celebration. And importantly, they attacked the Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan, during Eid, the biggest festival for the end of the month of fasting. So this is like, the spring festival, comparable to Easter or Nowruz and all of these springtime. This is the joyousest time of the year. That's when the state of Israel launched all of these campaigns using the power of the state and state violence, specifically to provoke a reaction, because they knew it's like an attack in America on Easter, right? If we had one most visible religious center that Easter was celebrated on, and then we launched tear gas into it during an Easter celebration. That's what actually happened. The state of Israel did that. That provoked the first response from Gaza, the revenge attacks, where these rockets were fired, and that brought the whole weight of the Israeli military down on this territory that they control. They control this territory. So I want to get across that this was choreographed. This isn't like they provoked the violence. They, being the state of Israel, provoked the violence that allowed them to engage the military to invade Gaza, knowing that the U.S. would have their back. And all of this is just to shake up the domestic political situation for this one fascist named Netanyahu, because he doesn't want to go to prison because he's a criminal, and he would otherwise. And that's the sad reality of what we're in. And immediately it turns into this, like, and rightly, you mix religion and identity in, and it's a powder keg. But at the root of it, you're talking about power, political power as expressed by a small group of people who control Israel and have controlled Israel for decades. That's Netanyahu's party. For decades, they've controlled Israel. And even when he loses, he doesn't lose. I mean, how many times have you seen the headlines about Netanyahu losing and Likud losing? But he retains power. He retains power. No one has ever taken over power. And if anyone does, Netanyahu loses. So that's what we're looking at here, is actually a really, really just violent, militaristic war crime to protect the political power of one person and his ilk in Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah, it's terrifying. So so how can people get involved and help?
I think, to me, the first thing, and I have done this twice now, and I make fun of myself for like sounding like a hippie, but I really mean it. It's this consciousness change. And what I really invite people to do is you have to start with the shared humanity of the Palestinian people. You have to really understand the shared humanity, that you have to understand people's lives, that these are human beings with dreams and wants. And I was reading this amazing essay in the New York Times about a Palestinian family in this assault, and their daughter's 6-year-old birthday happening in the middle of it. And she asked, can Israeli missiles hit the house if the lights are off? And the answer is definitely yes. But for her birthday, a 6-year-old, my son is 5. For her birthday, the parents decided to lie to her so that maybe she would feel a modicum of relief and say, no, as long as the lights are off, the missiles won't kill you and your sister and your mother and your father. Understand that their people, the Palestinian people, are they exist just like you and me do. My daughter came into my room as I was getting ready this morning, and I was like, hey, sweet pea, I'm getting ready. Can you go with mommy? And she's like, oh, daddy, I have a question for you. And I was like, yes. And I paused what I was doing for the very important 3-year-old question. And she's like, did you know that cats chase mice? And I was like, yes, I did. And she's like, okay. And then she left. And it was wonderful and it was beautiful. And I love my daughter with everything that I have. And I thought, because I just read this essay, how unfair it is that the question that this other child was asking was, will the Israeli missiles be able to hit our house on my birthday if we turn off the lights? When she should have been asking, did you know that cats like to chase mice? When you understand the humanity that's lost, and that we're losing our own humanity in perpetrating this violence, then the stakes become very clear. And then you can understand, and we can understand, that we must demand justice, that there is no other path on this. And what that means is standing with our allies, being partners and allies to people who are leading this movement. And there's more and more. But if you want to, look at what Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and AOC and Mark Pocan and so many others are saying right now, and push for more. We need senators coming on board, and we need to pressure the Biden White House to just pump the brakes, at least pump the brakes on this. If he's too scared to change foreign policy all the way, at least recognize the humanity of the people who are being slaughtered right now by military capabilities of a first world military funded and supplied by the United States of America. So that was a long answer, but it's at its root solidarity. But I really think that we misjudge if we at all think that the propaganda that we face since birth here about this issue is not powerful. We're wrong. To break out of that propaganda, the lie that we've been sold as to what's going on in Israel with Palestinian people is going to be, it's a large effort, and we should all work with each other to accomplish that. And be gentle with ourselves and each other as we try to reach a better understanding so that we can advocate a better future than the one that we're in right now. Does that seem right, Jocelyn?
Yes, I agree. And I just realized it's noon. So I have nothing to add to that. I agree with it completely. And it's tragic. And yeah, it's one of those things where there isn't a whole lot of positivity. But you're right. It is very encouraging to see members of Congress standing up on this issue, which unfortunately for so long, even progressive Democrats have not.
And so there's hope. And the hope is the same hope that Merith talked about previously on vaccine justice, on climate justice. And it all comes down to recognizing our shared humanity and then standing in solidarity with each other and recognizing that the people will be able to find a true path forward once we're not actually under the blinkers of this very small and powerful and super rich plutocratic sort of worldview. And the way we do that with solidarity. We love you, and we will see you next week. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.